It is important, though, for everyone on this webinar to understand we're not dispensing legal advice, and I'm going to clarify that for you in a minute or so. As we went into the COVID crisis, ISME had three essential demands of government. First of all, liquidity for small businesses, because we know so many of you out there are running out of cash. You're still keeping people on your books. You're still paying them, albeit using the wage subsidy scheme. And but you still owe a lot of money. And the figure we came up with was an average of £78,000 per small business that's owed to other people. So we're moving as hard and as fast as we can on that. The second thing we asked for, knowing that some businesses are going to get in trouble but are viable, we asked for examinership light access to the protections that are available for small businesses under the Companies Act. I have to be blunt and say we're quite a way off success on that one. And the third one that we asked for a number of weeks ago was a clear roadmap back to work, an operational roadmap of return to work. And as you know, Minister Heather Humphreys published that 2 weeks ago. Now, she published that within what's known as the LEAF Forum, the Labour Employer Economic Forum, and ISME are not members of that. So we did not have a contribution to make to that. And that meant that our staff had to look at that quite extensive document that was generated by IBEC, Chambers Ireland, the Construction Industry Federation and ICTU as it was published. And when we did so, there are a number of clarifications that arose, a number of issues, and that's where probably Adam and I will probably have to put the hand up if we're asked certain questions on this morning. We'll give you clarification to the extent we're comfortable to do so, but the fact is that the return to work protocol also goes out of kind of what we would view as strictly health and safety areas into areas, it intrudes into areas that possibly have difficulties with personal data. You know, when you start getting into stuff like taking people's temperatures, also into areas of strict HR law, in other words, sending people home who are symptomatic, if they look symptomatic when they return to work, and areas like that that are actually quite difficult to give definitive answers to. So please be aware that the people on this call today are going to give you the best possible answer within that context, but we have not had replies from the Data Protection Commissioner, from the Minister, from the Health and Safety Authority, or from the Workplace Relations Commission on certain formal questions. So it's within that context that you're going to get some of those answers today. But everyone here is going to do their very best to give you the most current and up-to-date answer, and those we can't, as Adam is going to be, I understand, Adam, you're recording this call, and we will do our best to revert with a solid answer as quickly as we can afterwards. So Adam, I think that's enough from me by way of introduction, and I'll hand back to you.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Yes, thanks for the reminder for recording. Actually, I missed the first 10 seconds of you, but we're going to get the main body of the answers anyway for the questions. So just introducing Coach Lynch as well. She's our HR advisor. Also, Yvonne Mullooly from the HSA. So we've got two sort of separate sheets of questions that all of you have very kindly sent in prior to this. So we hope that we get a lot covered. We've got about an hour and a half. If overruns a bit, doesn't matter. You're all very welcome. I'm going to slide into the background here, actually. I'm just going to stop my video as I need to get the Word docs up of the questions. So I'm going to go through it chronologically as they came in. The first topic that we're going to be covering is the wage subsidy scheme and payroll with bringing staff back, which is obviously we're close to doing this, so it's very pertinent. So the first question, will we be able to claim TWSS as we ramp up with possibly 1 day per week now returning to full employment in September, October? Brackets, the technicians are countrywide. so we will require all to ramp up gradually. What would we do if TWSS is discontinued before pubs reopen fully?
Okay, to answer the first part of that, sorry Adam, just to check, is my sound, has it gotten any better?
Yes, it has indeed.
Excellent.
You're good, yeah.
Excellent. So to answer the first part of that, the temporary wage subsidy scheme is available to any category of employees. So those who are not working, those who are working part-time, or anyone who's working their full-time hours. So absolutely, if you're bringing them back on a phased basis, the temporary wage subsidy scheme will apply to them. I suppose in terms of the second one, unfortunately, you know, there's no solid answer to that one. And obviously my area is staffing. So in terms of paying staff wages, etc., what you would be having to look at, you know, if it's not financially viable, is strategies such as temporary layoffs, redundancies, moving people to part-time, that kind of thing would be the suggestion around staffing issues there.
Super, thanks, Coach. Okay, the second question is, we have received higher amounts from revenue than we are entitled to. How or when will revenue reconcile their payments, and how do we repay? And there is a note as well as a caveat here, sort of saying, note, we requested revenue not to take normal payments due 23rd of March and have submitted normal returns since, but have not submitted for payment.
So Revenue updated their frequently asked questions document, and they're on version 12 of it now, and in that, in section 6.1, they actually lay out the process for refunding any overpayments. So we can circulate the link to that document, and it has a step-by-step process on how to do it.
Thank you, Coach.
Adam, can you hear me there? I just
yes,
want to,
I can, Neil, yeah.
Because it wasn't just exactly clear in that from that questioner what they meant by the overpayment, but I mean, we've had this issue as well. So just to be aware that some staff on the wage subsidy scheme will see themselves getting a higher net than they did in their normal payroll, and that's because their tax is not been taken out of it. So just in case the questioner meant that, and I'm not sure it wasn't entirely clear, but that is the part where the revenue is warning employees that this is subject to reconciliation later. They won't take the money off you, but what they will do is reconcile it against your tax credit. We all get a tax credit of €1,650 per annum, and they are saying that that's how they will correct it. But I mean, I know that we ourselves have staff who are effectively getting overpaid now because they're on the wage subsidy scheme. It is subject to reconciliation later.
Super, thanks, Neil. The third question is, how long can we claim TWSS if you are back to full production? Wages are paid weekly, but monthly turnover will be 25% lower.
So on this one, again, I would refer this person to the revenue guidance. They have outlined the criteria within this most recent version. And I suppose just to state as well, within that eligibility criteria, there are some shades of grey. So if an employer has any doubts over whether they're eligible, they should look for professional financial advice on it.
Super. The fourth question, we took on a new employee in early March. Because the employee was not on the payroll in January or February, they were not eligible for TWSS. They are currently on pandemic payment, but employer would like to rehire them but cannot do so with the aid of TWSS. Is there any way of overcoming this? The employee was in full-time employment elsewhere in January and February. It's a good question.
The short answer to that is no. The eligibility criteria is pretty clear that an employee must have been on the payroll on the 29th of February 2020. That hasn't changed, and it's still the case.
Okay, super. Gosh, that's an interesting one there. Okay, does the employer get any payment from COVID-19 scheme when reopening the business on a part-time or full-time basis?
So the temporary wage subsidy scheme is available for any employees. So if they're working part-time, they can still claim that temporary wage subsidy scheme.
Great, thank you. Can employees avail of COVID payments while working on reduced or short-time working?
Yes, the revenue guidance states that any employee can claim it. So if they're working reduced hours, absolutely.
Okay, actually, my apologies, Coach. I jumped to question. So I'm going back to question 6, which is, can employees return to work on fewer hours than normal, a 4-day week, and receive the COVID payment through payroll with a top up from the company of 10%? Should we take employees back on a 3-day week as an alternative? And can they then claim the short working hours benefit whilst being paid COVID payment through payroll?
So there's a couple of pieces in this one. Yes, you can pay 10% of the top up. Now, the guidance states that where possible, an employee should aim to top up the 100%, but it's not mandatory to get to that. If you're paying less than the 100%, you need to ensure that any reduction in payment is done through mutual agreement and in line with the Minimum Wage Act. And in terms of the second piece, revenue guidance states that employers shouldn't claim a subsidy in respect of any employee who's receiving a job seeker's payment. Now, the short time payment is a prorated version of that job seeker's payment, so that would indicate that no, they can't claim the two at the same time.
Okay, thanks, Coach. Actually, I've just got a question in which is actually tied in with what we're talking about now, so it's very relevant. So Caroline, thank you for that, just in the chat room there. Just a quick question. We have top up employees' wages since lockdown on top of TWSS. We are gradually bringing them back. When do we stop availing of TWSS?
So I suppose the guidance on this is that, you know, when you're in a financially viable position to do so, and obviously the eligibility criteria of the 25% downturn is still in place. So, you know, it will be a business decision to make if you're still within the criteria or not.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Coach. Actually, and John Ellis has just put one in there as well, saying the revenue overpayment question was the amount of refund we get after 2 days where they pay 144 question mark. I'm not quite sure what the question is there, Coach. Maybe that makes sense to you?
It does indeed, yeah.
Good,
so
okay.
what I would say there is go to the most recent FAQ document and click into section 6.1, and there's a step-by-step process there on how to refund any overpayment amounts.
Great, thank you. I hope that answers your question, John. Thanks for that. Okay, now we're just moving on to the next topic, and it is related, of course, is the refusing to return to work. So the first question there is what to do if an employee is needed but refuses to return to work for as long as the COVID payment is available.
Okay, so this is one that is causing a bit of worry out there, and it is definitely an issue. So as soon as work is available to an employee, that employee, by the definition of the pandemic payment, is no longer eligible for that COVID payment. Now, that's up to the employee to sign off on, but once you have ensured that any reasonable concerns or health issues have been addressed, if somebody is still refusing to return to work on the basis of the COVID payment, then your normal absence procedures, job abandonment procedures, etc., can be applied.
Super, thank you. Second question, we're encouraging staff to work remote. Sorry guys, could you mute yourselves please, guys? So I'm just trying to find the person there. Give me 2 seconds, sorry. No, can't find them. I've got 5 pages of people online there. So sorry about that, guys. Sorry, Coach. Just getting back to the questions here. Okay, question 2. We're encouraging staff to work remotely as much as possible, but if we decide we need someone for a sound reason, what happens if they refuse to come into the office? Okay,
so this is quite similar. You know, given the crisis period that we're in and the uncertainty, everyone should, and any employer should engage with the employee first, address any concerns that are raised, assess if there's any underlying medical conditions. But again, If everything is addressed and the employee continues to refuse, you need to be aware that working from home is a benefit granted at the discretion of the employer. If you require them to be in the office during normal office hours and every genuine concern has been addressed, then again, you can fall back on your usual internal disciplinary procedures around it.
Thanks, Cait. I'm sorry, I lost you for a couple of seconds there. I'm not sure if it was my end or your end, but I hope everyone got the answer there. If you didn't, just pop a note in the chat there, guys, because I'm going to move on anyway. I just got a question from Caroline Purcell here. Excuse me a second. So, hi, how do you handle an employee who is needed in work, has to stay at home to provide childcare as their partner is in HSE admin? That's a good question.
It is, and I suppose in terms of childcare, obviously, you know, you have to be very careful that you're not being discriminatory towards people who have children, so you should investigate if there is any flexible work options available. However, an employee doesn't have a legal entitlement to stay at home to mind children, and the suggestion that I would always say as a first measure is to see if they'd be willing to take their parental leave entitlement, part of their parental leave entitlement in these situations. It's an unpaid leave, and they would then be able to stay at home and mind their children.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question also related, is if staff who have underlying health issues or concerns about elderly family members, should we be enforcing disciplinary procedures if they do not want to come into the office?
So what I would be saying there is, as with any health issue, you need to be quite careful, and I would be suggesting that you engage with that staff member and ask them to contact their own GP, and if they get a letter from their own GP stating that they're not fit to work, then you should be treating it as any long-term absence in the company.
Super, thank you. Okay, if an employee says they have an underlying, oh, this is related to the one in the chat room, sorry, I'm just going chronologically here, but we'll ask it anyway. If an employee says they have an underlying medical condition and don't want to return to work, what can we do? I think you've just answered that, Cait, but if there's anything you want to add, please do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose, yeah, as I said before, it's just to be careful, and if they get a cert, to treat it like any long-term absence. And then I suppose the other thing to highlight of this is, if you have vulnerable employees who do return to the workplace, you need to ensure that you have added safety measures in place, such as closed off working spaces, good ventilation, dedicated times for break rooms, that sort of thing. Okay, super. So I'm getting messages coming in from the office here. We're going to move to Yvonne from the HSA after this. I've got one more question in the refusing to return, Cait. I'll just make sure I've got my microphone on. I do. Sorry, lots of things going on. Can't multitask. Question 4 was, if employees have issues with childcare, what rights do we have if we have full-time work for them? Yeah, so again, under equality law, you need to look at if there are any reasonable accommodations to see if you could facilitate home working, flexible working, that kind of thing, but you're not required to redesign a job for somebody, and where it's not reasonable to do so, you don't have to facilitate it. Again, the parental leave is an option, or, you know, taking a portion of annual leave for a couple of days or something like that is another option. But if they ultimately refuse to do any of those options and continue to refuse to come to work, again, you fall back on your internal procedures. Okay, thanks, Cait. I've just got one more in the chat room here that's it's just come in on the same topic before we move to Yvonne. Hi, still confused about staff returning on a 3-day week, brackets, receiving TWSS through payroll and claiming short time working for the other 2 days. Can they do this? No, so if they're receiving the TWSS, they are not entitled to also claim for the job seekers payment, which is what the short time working payment is. Okay, good. That's a good definitive answer there. Yvonne, if we could move to you, please. Yvonne Mullooly from the HSA. Just wait for her to unmute herself. I can actually unmute her. Hang on, I can do that here. Yvonne, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me now?
I can now, yes. Okay, yeah, absolutely. That's super. Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us. We really do appreciate it. So the questions I've got here, so the first topic, Yvonne, we're going to cover is general. you know, the inverted comma, what has to be done questions, you know, around hygiene, temperature, space, etc. So the first question for you is, what documents do companies need to have in place to facilitate returning to work safely? Are there any templates available for companies to work from?
Good morning, Adam and everybody. Just to say, I had to turn off my camera because I wasn't able to hear the question, so apologies for that. In terms of the protocol, it sets out very clearly in terms of what the steps that employers and workers must take before a workplace reopens or actually continues to operate. So in relation to your question, the protocol does outline what documents are required. So this would include a COVID-19 response plan, which needs to be developed in consultation with your workers. It talks about updating your risk assessments. There's a requirement for a return to work form, a log for contact tracing, and yes, you're right, there is templates and checklists available on our website, and they were uploaded there this week. So there is a number of templates and a number of checklists. There's a template for the COVID-19 response plan. There's a template for the return to work form that workers must fill out, and just to say that they must fill that out 3 days before they return to work, and doesn't have to be 3 working days. The weekend can be included. And there's 6 sets of checklists, one on planning and preparing before you open up, another one on control measures, another one on induction and familiarization for staff, another one then for dealing with suspected cases, and finally then we have one on cleaning and disinfection, and there's also a worker checklist.
That's great, Yvonne. Actually, I'm fielding a lot of questions around that, about the content they should be putting into sort of PowerPoint induction slides, etc., that people need to read before they go back. So that's great that those are in place. Question number 2: what are we legally required to provide, and what measures should be implemented for staff to protect against COVID-19?
Well, employers must ensure that they're in compliance with the return to work safety protocol and the measures that are contained within it. So they're set out clearly in the different sections. So the protocol outlines what is required. So as I mentioned, the COVID-19 response plan, which should be drawn up in consultation with your workers. That's very important. Employers also need to appoint at least one lead worker representative in relation to this. They need to have their policies and procedures for the identification and isolation of workers with COVID-19 symptoms, including, as I mentioned, the contact log for contact groups. They need to display information on the signs and symptoms of COVID. So you're probably aware that the HSE have developed quite a number of supports in that regard in terms of posters, etc. So they're also available on our website. We have links to them there too, so they can be sourced in those locations. Then the control measures to ensure that you're complying with the public health measures of hand hygiene, respiratory hygiene, and physical distancing. So all of that stuff is contained within the protocol, and also the checklist gives you pointers as to what to check in terms of determining your compliance. The protocol outlines that there's induction and training required, and of course updating of risk assessments to take into account any changes that you might have undertaken to work activities, to take account of the public health control measures. So as I said, the checklists are on our website, and should it be there, they will assist owners or business owners, etc., to get up and running in a way that will help prevent the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. Just a quick update on the muting yourselves, guys. I know some of you are still joining. Just make sure that you mute your microphones. I've got 5 pages of profiles of you. It's very difficult to find who to mute and what have you. So just please keep track of that. Thank you. Question number 3: are HSE recommendations advisory or compulsory?
Well, the measures that are outlined in the protocol are mandatory in the workplace, and the authority is charged, as you probably would have heard, with the oversight ensuring compliance with this protocol in line with occupational health and safety requirements. So under the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005, the authority does have powers in relation to providing advice, monitoring, inspecting, and enforcement adherence to the protocol if that is required.
Super, thank you. Okay. Question number 4. We're unsure of the physical setup of a small retail space. If an employee shows symptoms, a small shop does not have the space for isolation. How do we get them home?
Well, in terms of the protocol, it does require that employers need to put in place arrangements for dealing with persons who may be presenting and showing symptoms of COVID-19. So there must be some area within that retail space where the person can be waited or seated until there's arrangements made that they can either go home or go elsewhere, depending on what their GP's advice is. So I suppose a little bit of common sense and judgment needs to be taken in this regard. It's no different to what an employer would be already expected to have in place for workers who might fall ill during work. So the worker should be given a mask to wear, tissues obviously, and hand sanitizer, a waste bag, and other workers should be kept at least 2 meters away from that person. So if it's in a small space, just there needs to be an area determined as to where that person would wait. And they should also be advised, the person who's developing symptoms or displaying symptoms of COVID, to cover their mouth and nose, and that's probably where the mask will come in place.
Yes, excellent. So really just common sense applies there. Great. Okay, question 5. Will we get notification of inspection? If not, and our COVID-19 rep is unavailable for some reason, will the inspector rearrange a visit?
Okay, well, most health and safety authority inspections are actually unannounced, and when an inspector calls, they will look to speak to the person in charge, the owner or the manager. However, there may be cases, for example, if they're following up on a complaint or something and the inspector needs to speak with the COVID-19 representative, then the inspector may call, for example, to see if they're available. So.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. Okay, so we clean all touch points every 15 minutes. We're a food retailer. How often is recommended?
Okay, so if you look at page 4 of the protocol, it outlines that thorough and regular cleaning of frequently touched surfaces is essential. And there it also indicates that if disinfection is required, it must be performed in addition to the cleaning. So it's never as a substitute for cleaning. So that's the most, I suppose, a very important point to take away from the protocol. There is a section in the protocol to further in that covers cleaning, and the protocol outlines that surfaces need to be kept visibly clean and cleaned at least twice a day. So for example, at the start and the end of a shift. However, I appreciate that in the area of food hygiene, there may be other cleaning standards. So I suggest the person would contact their EHO if they're in terms of that kind of information and guidance. But as I said, the protocol outlines that just that surfaces are kept visibly clean and at least twice a day.
Okay, thank you. And
so every workplace will be different, obviously. Do you know what I mean? Some places.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So this question, I'm not sure whether it's with or without children, but it's this week. An increasing number of children arrived to the shop. It says with a parent, but I'm wondering whether it means without a parent. But how should this be handled, Yvonne?
Okay, well, if you look in the protocol, there is a section that deals with customer-facing roles on page 17. So, you know, in relation to customer-facing roles, it's about limiting physical interaction with your customers and workers. So, for example, providing hand sanitizer and physical barriers. There's no prevention on children or other persons being in the shop or a place of work that has customers in the protocol. So, I mean, it's up to the shop itself to exercise its own judgment in terms of the number of people, for example, that it would allow into the shop at any one time in order to ensure that it can maintain physical distancing rather than who is actually in the shop.
Super, thank you. So someone seeking some clarification with regards contact tracing records to be kept by the employer. I think that's a GDPR issue, isn't it? Sorry, Yvonne, can you hear me? Am I on mute? Sorry, hang on a sec. No, sorry.
Can you say that to me again? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just trying to understand the question here. So someone seeking clarification with regards to the contact tracing records to be kept by the employer. I think it's what's the employer's responsibility for retaining records of contact tracing, Yvonne?
Yeah, okay, sorry, the line dropped there a second.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's no problem. Well, the protocol refers to a contact log, so that's on page 6, rather than contact tracing records. So the purpose of the log is to assist in contact tracing if there is an outbreak in the workplace and to identify any close contacts. So employers need to explain the purpose of that contact log to the employee, so that's very important. So for example, identifying what workers are working together, they would be considered close contacts. And in some cases, a log in, for example, and a log out might be sufficient. It could be used to identify who has actually been in the workplace on a particular day. And then workers that are already working in specific pods or groups, the employer might already be aware of that kind of information. So a lot of the information is probably there already, and the employer would be aware of that. So it's a contact log. It's not about keeping contact tracing records.
Okay, thank you. And there are some questions popping into the chat room, Yvonne, so I'll get to those in a second. I think this question might be sort of industry driven, but I don't know what industry the person's asked this from. So what is the protocol for recording visitor information when delivering or collecting from our premises?
Okay, well, as I outlined in the previous question, there is a requirement in the protocol for a contact log. And so this could be the visitor information log. So for example, you might know that you know, somebody's coming, and then you know, you record the time and the date that they would enter and maybe leave the premises. Similarly, you also might be aware, for example, that your postman arrives at 10 o'clock every morning. So that can be obviously information that can be you know, it's known to the employer or the business owner, so they can have that in the contact log that the postman arrives at 10 o'clock every day for X number of minutes to, you know, deliver. So they'll be aware of that if there ever was an outbreak in the workplace, that they could inform their the HSE. They're doing their contact tracing.
Super, yeah. Actually, that's a good question. Can you please advise?
And in terms, just actually in terms of the contact tracing, I mean, you know, it would seem reasonable that a 14-day period would be sufficient to keep those records. Do you know, I mean, when you're talking about contact tracing, they talk about 14 days, so something in around that and there, you know, at least 14 days.
Oh, well, that's very good to know,
yeah.
Actually. Yeah, very good. Thanks, Yvonne. This is a good question, actually. Can you please advise on the recommended procedures around toilet facilities? We are in a business centre with several different companies and all share one toilet area. 3 cubicles in the male toilet, 3 cubicles for female, and 1 disabled. What is best practice here?
Okay, well, I suppose it very much depends on the setup within that particular, you know, those toilets and the size of them and all the rest of it. So, you know, for example, there could be small cubicles, it could be a very large space, etc. So in every particular case like this, I would suggest it would be good for the employer to talk to the landlord, who obviously has the oversight of it, and maybe the other companies that are using those toilets, about the measures that they're going to put in place in respective shared toilets. So, like off the top of my head, for example, if it wasn't possible to achieve physical distancing, if 2 or more people were inside in the toilet space, then it might be a case of setting up a 1 in, 1 out system in that case.
Yeah, very sensible. Okay. Okay, we've got, yes, question here about temperature. What is the guidance around temperature testing? Does it have to be implemented? Does it have to be recorded? How is the information to be stored?
Okay, this is quite a topical question, you know, at the moment. So if you look at the return to work safety protocol, it makes provision for the implementing temperature testing in line with public health advice. So currently, temperature checking is not an absolute requirement, a need for every workplace, and it only needs to be implemented in line with public health advice. So there may be local public health advice given to employer, or a specific advice to some particular sectors, for example, the nursing homes, to undertake the temperature testing and screening. So, you know, temperature screening is for a specific point in time to determine if someone is showing symptoms of COVID-19 and whether they should be in the workplace or sent home. So some employers, though, may have included provisions for temperature screening as part of their return to work control measures, all right. So there shouldn't be a need, for example, for that data, I don't think, to be stored for extended periods. As I said, it's really a point in time check. So just in relation to recording that information, and so it wouldn't seem to be necessary. because it's only a value, for example, when the person is coming and you're checking it off. But if, however, the temperature is recorded, then it needs to be kept in line with, obviously, with the data protection requirements. And it's important, I suppose, to be, the whole area of consultation with employees is very, very important. So it's important that the employer explains to the workers and other parties what it is for, and explains all that to them, and obviously, as I said, complies with whatever data protection requirements there is.
Okay, super, thank you. Question 12. Advice has been issued to companies regarding the cleaning and sanitizing of their premises twice a day. Will the HSA be issuing guidelines for the cleaning companies to follow in relation to training their staff in working in a non-clinical environment during COVID-19 pandemic, as they are at increased risk without the proper training or PPE, and there seems to be a discrepancy between understandings around cleaning and sanitizing? I see companies going in, fogging and spraying places that have not been cleaned. It's like trying to sanitize dirty hands. That's a very long sentence with a question inside there. Yvonne, are you happy what you've just heard to answer it, or do you want me to repeat?
I think I get a sense of it. Can you hear me, Adam? Sorry, my connection is dropping a little bit.
Yeah, I've got you back. I hope mine's okay as well. It's a little bit clunky, so apologies to everyone. Are you okay with that,
so
Yvonne?
As I understand, yeah, as I understand, the question is in relation to cleaning for non-clinical environments.
That's how I read it.
So page 4 of the protocol outlines. Page 4 of the protocol outlines that thorough, as I said, and regular cleaning or frequently touched surfaces is essential. And then if disinfection is required, it's seen really as a secondary step, and it must be performed in addition to any cleaning that is undertaken, so never as a substitute for cleaning. So that's an important point to make. And I think you said, I picked up the end of that sentence, it was like trying to sanitize dirty hands. Yeah, so the same principle applies. Now, there is information on page 7, or 15 actually, of the protocol, and also a link in there to guidelines for cleaning of non-clinical areas. So that's already within the protocol, so maybe some people mightn't have seen that. So it's important, just in terms of cleaning and cleaning staff, and obviously contract cleaners, so, or any particular job that somebody undertakes, all workers need to be trained, obviously for the task that they're doing, irrespective of COVID. So this requirement is true when it comes to all staff, including any cleaning staff that might be coming in, being employed by cleaning companies. So I hope that answered the question.
Very good. Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head there. What training does the COVID-19 representation require? Is there a back to work office checklist available?
Yes, I mentioned there earlier on that we have a series of checklists being published, and just to note, actually within the checklist it also covers cleaning, so that's a further aid to employers as well. So the checklists are all available on our website, and we have a COVID-19 webpage, so you'll see there that there's FAQs for employers and employees, but also there, as I said, the checklist, and I won't name them all again because I named them earlier on. But page 2 and page 7 of the protocol deals with worker representatives. And so they need to be involved in the developing the COVID response plan, and obviously aware of the measures and responsibilities that they have to do, and how they can actually connect back in with the employer, how they can bring worker feedback to the management owner. So for somebody who is the COVID-19 representative, they need to be very aware of the return to work protocol, and of course the public health measures, and our checklists that are available on the website. So each workplace, as you'll know in the protocol, needs to appoint at least one lead worker representative. So they're charged with ensuring that the COVID measures will be adhered to in the workplace. And it's important then that, as I mentioned, there's a responsibility in the employer to have regular and meaningful engagement with that person, and about them, as well as their other workers in the workplace, about what is being put in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace.
Okay, super. Yeah, there is a little bit of crossover on some of the questions, Yvonne. So thanks for answering that one. We have provided a digital thermometer for self-testing on entry, but does this need to be done daily? Is it mandatory? What happens if someone refuses?
Okay, so I covered this, it was temperature testing earlier on. So just to reiterate, I mean, if the protocol makes provision for implementing temperature testing in line with public health advice. So if an employer implements temperature screening, then it needs to be communicated before it's implemented. So it's important to explain to the workers, why it's being used, and so that they have an opportunity, of course, to understand it. And as I said, currently there's no blanket public health advice for temperature testing in every workplace, and but there is obviously advice for certain sectors, specific sectors, as I mentioned, but like say meat factories or healthcare, etc. But there also may be local public health advice may be given to some employers. So that's what needs to be followed. So the protocol also provides that workers must complete any temperature testing as implemented by the employer and in line with public health advice. So it makes provision for that as well.
Okay, super. This one is actually quite sectoral centric. For the private bus transport operators, are there any policy guidelines or information available for employees returning to work? So that's very sector specific. Yvonne, is there anything available there for these guys?
Okay, well, the protocol covers all workplaces and workers, and as does the checklist that I mentioned that are available on our website. So I just actually didn't realize I didn't give you the address of our website. It's www.hsa.ie. So they're all available there. So in terms of what is covered in the protocol for workers, the worker role is on page 6, 8, 11, 12, and 17. So there's also a worker checklist, as I mentioned earlier on, published, and this will give workers, I suppose, information in relation to what they need to be aware of as well. So it's good aid and support from that regard. I mentioned earlier on that workers need to complete the return to work form before they return to the workplace, and that's also available on our website. And as I said earlier on, that this needs to be completed 3 days in advance of returning to work. So, but it doesn't need to be three. It doesn't have to be 3 working days. So if you're coming back on a Monday, then Friday would be sufficient.
Okay, super, great.
And just to note that the return to work form also makes provisions. For example, if things change in those days, then they obviously would need to inform their employer if something happens between Friday and Monday.
Okay, yeah, okay, that's very precise. So really just keep driving people to the website because it's all there. That's good to know. Thanks, Yvonne. Next question, how do we manage corridor space and back-to-back seating with the usual 800 over 1000 degrees passageways between them? Can you get /pass on the COVID-19 when passing briefly? Does that make sense to you, Yvonne? Sounds quite technical.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure I follow the question, but in terms of the protocol, what it covers is physical distancing. So I think that's really what the question is about. So there is a need to maintain physical distancing of 2 meters. So when I heard you saying back-to-back seating, I mean, that would not appear to be compliant with 2 meters of physical distancing. So if physical distancing cannot be maintained, then the employer needs to look at other measures to keep people's interactions away from each other. So the protocol outlines you need to keep a meter distance, and also if you're doing that, then you need to put up other measures such as screens. You often see those in supermarkets, etc. And it's very important, though, if you're not able to maintain the 2 meters social distancing, and there is work activity that has to be undertaken, that interaction is kept to a very short period of time, as short as possible. And there should be hand hygiene facilities available beside where the task has been undertaken, so that it can be people can clean their hands as soon as the task is finished. So yeah, so it's very important that if there needs to be, for example, interaction between 2 people for a very short period of time, if that happens, then they need to clean their hands and obviously be aware of the public health measures, not to touch your face, all that good stuff.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, actually, this is an interesting one. Are there allowances in the protocol in the case of a family-run enterprise where all staff are members of the one household?
Okay. In terms of, I hope I understand the question. You know, if there's a workplace and it's family members that are all working in the same workplace, then they're still workers and covered by occupational safety and health legislation. So the requirements of occupational health and safety apply to them, and as does the protocol. So I think, is that the question I've been asked?
I think, yeah, the way I read it, Yvonne, was that there's a family and they all get up for breakfast in the morning and they all head off to the same place of work.
Well, in terms of contact tracing, obviously there would be, you know, that would form, if there was a COVID-19 outbreak in the workplace, then they would be obviously a group that would be, you know, together in terms of contact tracing that the HSE may, you know, like, because if one of them becomes exposed, then the rest of the members in the family will become exposed. So.
Oh yeah, yes,
yeah,
okay.
Or potentially, sorry.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And is the employer liable if government guidelines are not followed in the workplace and a member of staff contract the virus in the workplace?
Well, I mean, I'm not in a position to offer advice in relation to liability, but employers must follow the protocol and the public health advice.
Okay, now we're going to move, just before we move on to PPE, Yvonne, some questions have been coming up whilst we've been in discussion in the chat room. So I think some of them will have been put in 10-15 minutes ago, so they might cover off, you know, refer back to something that you've covered. So do bear with us on this. So I'll ask them just chronologically. Are essential workers who have continued to work throughout COVID required to undergo the same return to work procedures as non-essential services who have not been working? For example, one of our essential workers was stopped yesterday and asked about our return to work protocols. How we must now compile a report to the, I'm not sure what that means. Sorry, I think it says, you know, do we now have to compile a report to the HSA?
Well, the protocol covers workplaces that are already open, so with essential workers, as well as the phase 1 and the different phases under the roadmap. So yes, they do need to have their COVID-19 response plan and the various measures then in place for that. So the contact log, all that other good stuff. So yes, the protocol does apply to existing workplaces. But they should, you know, they may already, many workplaces already have those plans, but they would need to update them in line with the publication of the protocol if there was aspects that they hadn't covered.
Right, okay. And in fact, the contact log, there is a question there that says, for the contact log, what is the definition of a close contact?
Well, in terms of the definition of a close contact, it's somebody who you're working with for greater than 15 minutes within that 2 meter physical distancing. But just remember, you know, this only kicks in terms of like if there's an outbreak in the workplace, then the HSE would come in and they would do risk assessment to determine, you know, which particular groups of workers would be relevant in terms of the contact tracing. That's not something the Health and Safety Authority would be doing.
Okay, thank you. It's quite a good question, actually. How many can travel in a lorry? We would normally send 5 men in a lorry. Can this happen now?
Well, there is advice in the protocol in relation to workers traveling together. I mean, one of the measures within the protocol relates to physical distancing. So obviously, if there's 5 workers in a lorry, then that would not be in compliance with physical distancing. So measures need to be put in place where possible for workers to travel separately. Now, if there's 2 workers, for example, in a space, then, you know, other measures need to be put in place, such as the wearing of masks, and it's important that all touch surfaces within the vehicle are cleaned down at the start and at the end of the shift as well.
Of course, very important, yeah. Next question in the chat. We have staff who have to travel to hotels together to deliver large quantities of product. This requires 2 people to travel together. Is this okay? I think that's very much in line with what you've just answered, Yvonne.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can 8 people work in an office all day? I suppose it depends on how big the office is.
Yeah, I mean, every employer would need to, you know, that's not a blanket yes or no question that won't give an answer to, because it will obviously depend on the size and the space they're dealing with in that particular workspace. So, for example, if the 8 employees are greater than 2 meters apart, well then, yes, they can.
Yeah, okay.
But I mean, it's very much, you'd have to be, you know, you have to take the whole of the round into account when you're looking at a particular workspace like that.
Yeah, okay. And there's one from Shane here, but I think we've covered this off, but I'll ask it anyway. Clarity of definition of close contact. I note that the WHO references 15-minute period within 2 meters, but guidance suggesting 15 minutes accumulative.
I think I covered that in relation to, well, it's the potential for a close contact is if two people are working together less than 2 meters apart for 15 minutes.
Okay, yeah, fine. And if you proceed working in cafe business, serving food and coffee takeaway, can your clients use the bathroom, or would it be safer not to let anyone in?
Well, we have actually a question on our website in relation to that. I mean, it is you know, people obviously have to have provisions for being able to sanitize their hands, etc., and obviously to go to the toilet. So in terms of that, I mean, if you have people coming to your premises, then it would seem reasonable in the current circumstances to allow them to avail of those facilities. If they are customer facilities, then they should be allowed to continue to do those, use those facilities. And obviously there needs to be provision there for hand hygiene, etc.
Of course, yeah, okay. We usually have a cleaner coming in once a week, no daily contract cleaning. Do we need to provide guidelines for our staff to clean office twice daily? Is this sufficient?
Well, the minimum requirements in terms of what's outlined in the protocol is that cleaning at least twice a day. So yes, there would need to be provisions made as part of the plan, the COVID response plan for the business, to ensure that there's cleaning undertaken twice a day. So for example, at the start and the end of the shift. Okay. So this might be, in some cases, providing workers with wipes, etc., to clean down their touch surfaces, stuff like that.
Okay, someone's just pointed out actually that the COVID-19 pages are down on the website. I don't know if that means the HSA website. I assume it does. Okay. But thanks for pointing that out. I just move on to the questions. I'm just conscious.
I can check that now if you want from my side. Just to see.
Please do. Yeah, absolutely. I'll carry on with the questions because I'm just conscious of time and we've got quite a bit to get through. I'm in the retail clothing industry. What am I supposed to do with fitting rooms and garments that customers are trying on?
Well, in terms of the protocol, it's very clear in terms of like provision of hand hygiene. So there would need to be a provision of hand hygiene facilities within the shop. And where you have customers in place, it depends on the fitting room. So for example, if there was 4 fitting rooms and it wasn't possible that if the 4 fitting rooms were occupied, that the physical distancing would be provided for, well then there may be need for, as I said, a bit like the toilets earlier on, a system of 1 in, 1 out or whatever works to ensure that you're able to comply with the measures.
Super. And how many passengers would be allowed to travel on, for example, a 52-seater bus, Yvonne?
Well, it'll depend on how the bus is laid out, for example, but the 2 meters physical distancing would be there in place. But you will be aware that there is also advice from NEFIT in terms of the wearing of masks, cloth masks, when inside in public spaces and closed spaces.
Okay. And lastly, in the chat room here, we have some people that travel to work in 1 car together. They do not drive as part of their job. We have advised as strongly as possible to stop this. Is this a contact? Car journey is only 5 minutes.
Well, in terms of the actual, the advice on the protocol is that people should travel separately. So it'd be important then if they are, if you're traveling, for example, on public transport, I suppose it could be akin to something like that. So wearing of face cloth, face coverings, and the advice in relation to traveling on public transport is that you clean your hands before and after you enter the vehicle, and also that you would obviously before you come into work that you would do the same, that you would clean and sanitize your hands before coming into the workplace. Okay. But yes, in terms of contact, I mean, they're a regular group of people that travel together on a daily basis, so they would be a particular contact group.
Okay. Now I'm going to. We've got these are the last 3 questions. Okay, because we're going to move on back to the back to the other set of questions, Yvonne. I'm just conscious of time, everyone. Do HSA intend to communicate with employees?
Our own employees, yes, we do. But in terms of I mean, it's the business owners, in terms of a business itself and their employees, it's the responsibility of the business owner to engage. I mean, I said earlier on, the communication is key here in terms of the COVID response plan. It's very much about collaboration with your employees and making sure they understand what control measures are in place, that they understand the signs and symptoms of COVID, that they understand why things are being undertaken and changes are being put in place in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. As I said earlier on, there is a checklist there for employers, but also a checklist there for workers. So, you know, if that's really the question that they're asking, there is something there already.
Excellent. Yes. Okay. That makes total sense.
And just I just checked the website, so it's working here fine.
Okay. Okay. That's good to know. Excellent. Okay. Last couple of questions here. In relation to retail clothing, is there protocol on clothes that have been tried on? I think we covered that one off, John. Just on to the next one. What is the protocol for trying on clothes going forward? I think we've done that. Accessing HSA website, HSA website, fine, and COVID pages all live at the moment. Thank you, Joanne. That's great. Good to know. Well, Yvonne, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, we do have, we've just got 3 questions
on hold. Please wait.
Sorry, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I just got a strange message through my headphones there. Sorry, that's good. We've just got 3 questions on PPE.
No problem.
So is there clear guidance on the wearing of cloth face masks in the workplace? Some employees prefer them to face shields. Are they acceptable in place of surgical masks, which are more difficult to get hold of?
Okay, so just to be very clear, cloth face masks are not PPE. So in terms of that, just to be very clear on that. And as I mentioned there earlier, at the moment there is public health recommendation to wear cloth masks or coverings when in crowded public spaces, for example, public transport or in a retail store. So page 14 of the protocol outlines where wearing a mask is not, that it's not a substitute for other measures. So that's very important to remember. I mean, the measures are hand hygiene, physical distancing, and good respiratory etiquette. So it's important that they're front and foremost in people's minds. So the wearing a mask is definitely not a substitute. But just if masks are worn, they should be clean and they should not be shared or obviously handled by other work colleagues. So in terms of PPE and the use of masks in a workplace, like when it comes to the workplace, a risk assessment needs to be completed to determine what, if any, appropriate PPE needs to be put in place for that particular employee. So, for example, it may be because there's exposure to a particular chemical and there's a particular type of PPE required, or you know, a certain type of glove or something like that. So it's very much based on the task, and it's part and parcel of the risk assessment in the workplace. So that would determine what type of PPE then was necessary. But I mean, in general, from the public health recommendation, you will have heard that, you know, people working outdoors and in outdoor spaces, provided that they can maintain the 2 meters physical distancing, they don't need to be wearing masks.
Okay, thank you, Yvonne. Actually, someone just popped a question in there. It was actually from John, who I thought we'd covered that off in the previous question, Yvonne. Yeah, she's just specifying about specific clothes that have been tried on in the fitting rooms, not the fitting rooms per se.
Okay, well, as I said, the important thing, the 3 things to remember is the physical distancing, that's one, so it's not that issue. The second thing is the hand hygiene. So there needs to be measures in place whereby the person would exercise hand hygiene before and after they would try on the clothes. So that should address the issue. It's the same with handling it any other, you know, it's the same as any other practice. It's about, I suppose the most way that it's spread is very much in relation to contact. So it's about the same as cleaning surfaces, so regular cleaning. So the same with exercise for hands.
Okay, super, yeah. And actually there's a question that's just come in by email. One of my employees is 68 years old. I'm concerned about bringing her back to the workshop, back to work in the shop, which is a florist. Due to her age and the vulnerability of that age cohort to the virus, any advice on the matter would be appreciated.
That's probably something more for Cait.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. Cait?
Yeah, absolutely. So this one is with vulnerable employees. You know, there's a fine line between your duty of care under the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act and discrimination on the various grounds. So you have to be quite careful here. And I suppose what I would be doing is I would be engaging with the employee, having a chat with her, discussing the protections that are around. And if you're extremely worried, you can always ask her to provide a fit to work cert before she returns.
Okay, thank you, Cait. Yeah, sorry, we just on the clothes, when people are actually trying on the clothes, John is concerned that the clothes might be contaminated. There's been a suggestion that the clothes, once tried on, should be held on a separate rack for a couple of days. What's the protocol on that, Yvonne?
Well, there isn't anything in the protocol in respect to specifically, you know, clothes being put away for 3 days. In terms of where that's coming from potentially is in terms of waste material. So if there's tissues and cleaning waste, then the recommendation around disposal of waste would be that it's double bagged and it's left for 3 days. And then it can be put into the general waste. So that's where that 3 days is coming from.
Okay, super, thanks. Okay, I'll just go back to the PPE. I think we're on the last question there. No, sorry, second to last, penultimate. As a food manufacturing company with a snack line, are face visors sufficient with the usual precautions in place? Should one use face masks as well? We are putting in automatic temperature control also. Are dividers necessary if people are only a metre apart on a production line? This would be awkward as a product is passed along. I think there's 2 questions in there.
Okay, so
you understand that? Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Well, the protocol, as I mentioned, outlines a physical distancing of 2 meters. If workers are working less than 2 meters, then provisions need to be put in place, and they're outlined in the protocol in order to maintain at least 1 meter physical distancing, or as much distance as reasonably practical. So while masks could be used for work activities for a short period of time, I mean, they're not intended as a substitute, as I said, for other measures like physical distancing. So where possible, other barriers, etc., put in place, and as suggested, sneeze guards, etc. So it very much, you know, it's very much you need to keep as much physical distancing as possible, and at least 2 meters or as much distance as reasonably practical. And then, as I mentioned before, it's important that there's facilities there as well for workers to practice good hand hygiene.
Of course, thank you. And lastly here, what's the general advice in the terms of masks in the office environment? So this question, they're worried about trying to be helpful in supplying the masks, but they actually supply the wrong mask and it's coming back to bite them. What's the understanding of that, Yvonne?
Well, as I said, you know, we kind of forget that, you know, masks are not a substitute for other measures like the physical distancing, the hand hygiene and the respiratory etiquette. So they're first and foremost. So a bit like what I said before in terms of the response to that question around masks. But if you're supplying masks, well then, as I said, it very much depends on what they're being used for. And if it's, for example, the purpose is for PPE, specific PPE, then, and it's proposed for an 8-hour period, then I would have to say you would definitely need to look at other options, but because it wouldn't, you know, the use of PPE for an 8-hour period, such as a face mask, wouldn't be really considered. Other things would need to be considered first and foremost, such as engineering controls, etc. So in order to reduce the amount of time that the mask would have to be worn for. So just to say, actually, and there was a question there in relation to the retail and the clothing. This is the first week, actually, that the consultative forum is meeting. They're meeting on Friday. So, I mean, there's obviously other areas for clarifications. This is one that we can raise in respect of further advice.
Okay, thank you. And there's just one last one in the chat room, and then we will move on, guys. But are there any metrics on the amount of customers who can be in the shop at any one time? I have to say I've seen sort of varying different metrics from which I assume has been from the shop owner themselves. But I wonder, is there actually something set in stone on that, Yvonne?
Well, as I outlined, I mean, what the requirement is in terms of ensuring physical distancing between the customers and the workers. So from that perspective, you need to judge in terms of, how, for example, the shop is laid out. Is there particular areas of the shop where there, is we'll say busier than other areas of the shop? So, it will very much depend on each particular shop and workplace. And as I said, you'll see a lot of places have provision for one in, one out type of system. So you need to keep that under review. And if you find that things are getting too busy and there's people are, it's not suitable, then you'd have to obviously restrict the number of people that would be allowed into the shop.
Of course, yeah, very good. Okay, I suppose it depends on square meterage and all that sort of thing. So, very good, Yvonne. That's super. Thank you very much for your input there and your insights. That's been very useful. And we're moving back to Cait now, but please feel free if you've got something to add when questions for Cait, please chime in. Please feel free to do so. So thanks very much for that. Cait, going to bring you back in now.
Can I just jump in on one question that was asked a little while ago that Yvonne fielded, and it was just around the legal liability. So I just want to say that there are provisions in the Health Act where a civil liability case could be taken potentially. So that's why these protocols are so important, that you're complying with them, and just that you document, as per the HSA website, document everything that you're doing.
Very good. Yep, excellent. Okay. So the next title we're moving to is the roadmap. And I think that's the sort of staged return to work, etc. So the first question is, this week saw the return to work for construction workers for exterior projects. Many buildings and fit out companies seem to have taken this as a green light to resume all activities, indoor or outdoor. This is putting pressure on manufacturers of fitted furniture items who are being asked when they will be delivering and installing such items. According to the roadmap, indoor manufacturing and construction should not begin until the 8th of June. What sanctions, if any, will be applied to sites that open and request their sub-suppliers to do the same to deliver product for its indoor fit-outs? And what capacity is there to police the reopening of the building sites?
Okay, this might be one that Neil might want to jump in on after myself, but I suppose in terms of the roadmap, the guidance that is there does state that indoor manufacturing shouldn't be opening until the 8th of June. And those roadmaps are the protocols that are in place. While it's understandable that people are getting frustrated by not being able to open when potentially their competitors are and all the rest of it. All I can say on that one is that, the guidelines that are there are the guidelines that are in place, and they're the ones that, are expected to be adhered to at this stage.
Okay, thanks, Cait. Just a second one here. Has the government put a time frame in place regarding the back to work protocols, i.e. if/when the immediate danger is reduced or under control, will there be any relaxing of these protocols?
Again, on this one, I suppose the information that's there is the roadmap that was published that went as far as the 10th of August. And I think, it's all going to depend on how the staged relaxing of the restrictions goes. And then at a later date, if everything is all going well, there will probably be more information published on this.
Okay, thank you. I've got one in the chat room here. A question for Cait. If you have to move a staff member to a 3-day week from a 5-day week and it moves beyond short term, then can they look at redundancy?
Okay, so the definition, now this is an interesting question actually, because the definition of short time for receiving social welfare support is a 3-day week. However, the legal definition under employment legislation is less than half of their normal working hours. So if you are moving them from a 5-day week to a 3-day week, it doesn't fall under the definition of short time. Therefore, it has to be done with the consultation of the employee, and it has to be mutually agreed. If you have moved them to less than half of their normal working week and it's short time, then after 4 consecutive weeks they can claim redundancy. Now there has been a pause put on that under emergency legislation, but that emergency legislation is running out on the 31st of May.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm just going back to to questions aimed at you, Coach. There's a bit of a double up with the HSA ones as well, so I'm just trying to sift through which ones we've covered and which ones we haven't. Just trying to pick up where we're supposed to be. Okay, I think we've covered this, but are the HSE recommendations advisory or compulsory?
So these, I suppose, what you need to be looking at is that, you know, the national protocols are in place. The HSA have the authority to shut down companies if they are non-compliant. Now, in fairness to the HSA, I know they have committed to communicating and, you know, trying shutting down would be a last resort, but, you know, that is the ultimate end if you're non-compliant with those guidelines, is that your business could be closed as a result.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
just to reinforce that the protocol is mandatory. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think we did actually cover that one off, Yvonne. So thank you for clearing that up. So yeah, some of these questions we have already asked. So I'm just making sure that we're getting to the next one. So this is question 11 on the questions that were sent through to us, Coach. There are not enough hours in the day or days in the week to put staff into 2 teams of A team and B team. So as they don't overlap, what do we do in this situation as staff do not want to reduce their hours?
Yeah, so obviously the most important thing is that you can enforce the protocols within the workplace. So if that means you need to stagger teams, then that, you know, obviously that has to be brought into play. If staff members are not willing to reduce their hours, you know, you could end up looking at, is there a facility for an employee to complete part of their work at home? Is there, you know, employees may agree to use some of their annual leave each week. So say they take a day's annual leave each week to accommodate it for a temporary period of time. And then alternatively, I suppose the more drastic measures that employers may be facing if they are looking at the fact that their building will never be able to accommodate their staff numbers and staff are not willing to reduce hours, it could end up in more drastic measures like layoffs, redundancies, that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I think we're moving on to a topic here which is tied in sort of with the wages that we started with, but it's around letting staff go, reducing hours and rehiring. So question number 1, can you let someone go? Can you let go some of your employees for good during this period?
So there's no changes to employment law in this area in terms of terminating contracts. So you can, but it may become a redundancy situation, or if it's performance related or anything like that, you still have to go through your fair procedures. Notice procedures must be applied, and if it's a redundancy situation, payments will be due to anyone with over 2 years service. Okay,
thank you. And staff returning from maternity leave where there is currently not a full-time role.
Okay, so this one is a tricky one, and obviously any business owner is aware that maternity leave is protected leave, and therefore, you know, it's important to ensure that any moves made to somebody coming back from maternity leave cannot be construed as discriminatory. So any change to core terms and contracts must be agreed with the staff member, and if you are changing hours, etc., what I would be advising is that you ensure that within a department
You've been placed on hold. Please wait.
Within a department that this person is coming back to, that you know, they're not the only one who these actions are being taken against. So you need to ensure that any actions are not as a result of the fact that the employee hasn't been in the workplace for a period of time.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Coach. Have you any general advice with moving staff to part-time?
Yeah, so again, unless you have a provision in your contract for short time, it has to be done with mutual consent. You can't change contracted hours or payment without consent of the employee. If the situation is not short time, you absolutely have to have signed agreement for your employees in advance of implementing any changes to their contracts.
Okay, thank you. And we have a number of temporary workers on TWSS, and it is now clear that they are unlikely to be required. How do we take them off TWSS? We intend giving a minimum of 1 week notice to allow them to sign on to job speakers.
Okay, so I suppose the first thing to note is that it was a term in the temporary wage subsidy scheme that stated that an employer intends to keep employees on the payroll for the duration of the scheme. So if you're continuing with the scheme, you may need to check that out with your financial advisors or the Revenue Online system. The type of contract that's in place will determine how you go about terminating the contracts. But again, it's important to note that employment legislation, as usual, still stands. And if it's due to the roles no longer being required before the end date of a specified date contract, it becomes a redundancy situation. Now, obviously, if they're on a temporary contract, they may not be entitled to redundancy payments, but you still have to go through the process and go through fair procedure. In terms of ceasing an employee from the revenue scheme, it appears to be quite simple in the guidance, and again we'll circulate the link to the guidance, but it states that you return the employees to their correct PRSI class and then process payroll as normal.
Okay, thank you. And this one's related to, is how much notice must we give to someone who is on the wage subsidy scheme at present, but we will have to lay off once the subsidy ends?
Okay, so again, as above, it does become a redundancy situation. So statutory notice will apply unless you have specified a longer notice period in your contract. So the contract is the first place to check. But after that, if they've been with you 13 weeks to 2 years, it's 1 week. 2 years to 5 years is 2 weeks. 5 years to 10 years is 4 weeks. 10 to 15 years is 6 weeks. And if they've been with you more than 15 years, it's 8 weeks.
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself there. Can we change people's working? Can we change people working hours or days of work to suit the business needs?
So there's a couple of scenarios here. If their hours and days are defined in the contract, so for example, if their contract says Monday to Friday 9 to 5, then you have to get their mutual agreement. If the contract states hours will be assigned as per business requirements, you need to assess how long they've been working a particular work pattern, as custom and practice may apply. If they've always been working variable hours, then you can continue to change them as per the business requirements.
Okay, thank you. If people have been laid off and put back on the books under the COVID-19 employment scheme, what's their holiday entitlement?
Okay, this is actually a very good question, because if they don't accrue annual leave while on layoff, so if they're part-time, they accrue their 8% of hours worked, and the time on layoff doesn't count towards that. If they're full-time, the 20 days can be prorated, except if they end up working over 1,365 hours in the year. That 1,365 is the magic number, and if they work over that in a year, they're entitled to the 20 days.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, just looking at, okay, so these questions are around working from home, Cait. The first one is, are there regulations as an employer need to address to facilitate any workers who would rather work from home for part of their work week, e.g. furniture supply, guidance on Working Time Act, H&S in the home workplace?
Absolutely. The safety, health and welfare at work still applies for employees working from home. So employers still have that duty of care and those responsibilities under that act. So they need to ensure that the workspace is safe, that the equipment is safe, suitable and necessary to complete the work. They need to ensure that there's sufficient workspace, there's adequate lighting, heat, ventilation, all those regulations still apply. Adequate breaks, the Organisation of Working Time Act still needs to be complied with, and they still have their obligations around emergency contacts and procedures and all the rest. What I will say on this one is I will refer to the HSA website. They have a fantastic frequently asked question section on working from home, and that has a huge amount of information around your responsibilities there.
That's a very good point, actually. Yeah, the FAQs there are very good and detailed. Just before I move on to the next section, which would be our final question, but I've got a couple in the chat room here, Cait. Do apprentices have to return full time, or can they return for 3-day week?
So again, this will be a case of looking at the contracts that are in place for the apprentices. With apprentices, obviously their training schedule is, done in line with a training body, that kind of thing. So I would be suggesting that you look at the contracts and you discuss it with whatever training body is providing the training aspect of the apprenticeship. Look at what their requirements are and make a decision there. But again, if you're moving them to a 3-day week and their contract is for full time, it needs to be done with their agreement.
Okay, thank you. And one last one in the chat room here. Will there be a change happening to legislation at the end of May with regards to redundancies?
We haven't had any confirmation that there will be or that there won't be as of yet. So, we will absolutely, the ISME website, the ISME social media channels, if there is a change, it'll be communicated out.
Lovely, thank you. And finally, there's a title here called Looking Forward. I've got one question in there, Cait. We won't be able to open this year, as even if the government allows us to open on the 8th of August, we would make a loss with social distancing measures in place. Will there be any government grant for rent, lease payments for the next 6 to 12 months?
Okay, and I suppose again, this is one that we can't really give a concrete answer on because it's looking into the future, and while it is frustrating for businesses that are trying to make plans for reopening, I think what I will say is that what's there and available at the moment is listed on our website. There is a restart grant, there's various loan schemes, but what in terms of promising what may come in the future, unfortunately at this stage we can't do that.
Adam, I might be able to hop in there.
Yes, Neil, far away.
That's an issue, and some of you may have seen the Tonight Show on Virgin Media last night, and the restaurateurs and publicans were on, and the same issue applies. And if I can kind of generalize what the questioner's effective issue is at 2 meters, the number of people that can safely come into a premises is X, and if it was reduced a little bit to 1 meter, you would effectively double the number of people and the amount of footfall that would come in. And in the absence of there is a certain number for each individual business at which viability kicks in. In other words, I think what the questioner is driving at is I have a certain fixed cost that I have to meet if I open, and if I'm not going to cover that fixed cost, it's uneconomic for me to open. So absolutely get that. There are 2 aspects to that. On the one hand, there are the public, the social distancing guidelines, and at the moment they're 2 meters. They may reduce, and we will have to wait and see what happens over the next weeks and months there. In relation to finance and liquidity, unfortunately, that was the area I started off with at the beginning, and saying we have not enjoyed a great deal of success there at the moment. The grant aid, the only real grant aid that's available is based on your last year's commercial rates. You will get, there's a minimum of 2,000 but a maximum of 10,000 euro available. And in view of what you've heard from Cait and Yvonne there in terms of PPE cleaning, the requirement for external and internal cleaning, additional cleaning materials, there is going to be a significant cost for a lot of businesses in opening, consistent with the health and safety guidance. So that is what is the core of this question. So we absolutely understand that some businesses are not going to be commercial at the current level of social distancing guidelines. Every business has to make a commercial call on that. But please be aware that we are working as hard as we can with 2 consolidated groups called the SME Recovery Plan. On one side, you will have seen John Moran very busy on that. And on the other hand, the Local Jobs Alliance, you're going to see that published very soon. We really are working as hard as we can to get you grant aid to assist you with this sort of stuff. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, well, that actually rounds the session off. The questions have all been completed, the ones that were sent in prior to this. So just looking in the chat room there, I don't think there are any new questions. There's some thanks coming in from people. So no, thank you for joining us. That's great. Just to say, I'm actually hopping off this and going on to another very much an HR related webinar that we are hosting with Caroline McHenry of the HR Suite, who Cait knows very well. And it's managing employees returning to work after COVID-19 and retention strategies whilst we're out of work. So you can still last minute sort of register for that via our website. So please feel free to do so. It is in continuation with this. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us this morning. You've all been very welcome, and we hope that we answered your questions. If not, please feel free to drop us a line, get in touch with us via the website and what have you. There are some very good support services there, so please avail of them. So thanks, everyone. Thank you to Yvonne from the HSA. That was very, very useful. Thanks to Cait, thanks to Neil, and enjoy the rest of the week. It's nearly the weekend, guys. Take care now.
Bye-bye.